Hi, and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Blue Carbon in Practice, Results from the Tampa Bay Blue Carbon Assessment. Everyone has been placed in listen-only mode, so please, if you have questions, enter them into the question chat box. And our speakers will be taking these questions at the end of the webinar. So we'll go ahead and get started for today. And first, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers today. My name is Stephanie Simpson. I'm the Blue Carbon Program Coordinator for Restore America's Estuaries, and will be serving as moderator for today's webinar. We will also be hearing from Dr. Steve Crooks, Director of Climate Change Services for Environmental Science Associates. He acts as co-chair of the International Blue Carbon Working Group and was a member of the IPCC working group that drafted the 2013 guidelines to include wetlands into national greenhouse gas inventories. Dr. Crooks was also a lead PI for the Tampa Blue Carbon Assessment, and will start us off today with a brief intro to blue carbon and the Tampa project. Then we'll hear from Lindsay Sheehan. Lindsay is an hydrologist and coastal engineer specializing in tidal hydraulics, sediment transport, habitat evolution, and the restoration of coastal and estuarine ecosystems. Her work at ESA includes numerical modeling, GIS analysis, and hydraulic, geomorphic, and water and sediment quality technical analysis in support of tidal wetland restoration projects and coastal processes assessments. And she led the modeling for the Tampa project and will be presenting report findings today. And then finally, we'll hear from Holly Greening. As Executive Director of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, Holly is responsible for maintaining the strong partnership forged through the Estuary Program, continuing the Bay's science-based restoration and recovery strategies. She also currently serves on the Florida Oceans and Coastal Council and the National Working Group for Blue Carbon. So before I hand it off to Steve, I want to briefly introduce Restore America's Estuaries as your webinar host and the purpose of this study. Restore America's Estuaries is a national nonprofit, and we're dedicated to the protection and restoration of our nation's bays and estuaries as essential natural resources. And we lead an alliance of 10 conservation organizations across the U.S. coast. We're located just outside of Washington, D.C., and as such provide a united voice for coastal conservation in the nation's capital and advance the science and practice of protecting and restoring estuaries through on-the-ground projects, groundbreaking science, high-level meetings, and the power of convening people. One such program area where we coordinate to achieve these goals is through our National Blue Carbon Program, where we work to expand the science on wetland carbon ecosystem services called Blue Carbon and explore opportunities to use blue carbon to support and drive additional investment in coastal restoration. The purpose of this Tampa study was to better understand the role of Tampa Bay habitats and the role that they have in mitigating atmospheric greenhouse gases, and explore how this ecosystem service can be included in coastal management plans and support restoration efforts. This study builds on a previous study we led in 2014 to determine the climate benefit of estuary restoration in the Snohomish estuary of Puget Sound, results of which are available on our website. And Tampa Bay made an ideal setting for this study to further explore blue carbon ecosystem services, as it is one of the few places in the U.S. to have 3 critical coastal habitats, including salt marsh, seagrass, and mangroves. This, coupled with a very engaged and active coastal community that is already seeing success in their habitat recovery efforts, makes this an exciting area to work in. So our project objectives included determining the climate mitigation benefit provided by Tampa Bay habitats, including how sea level rise will impact these habitats and their blue carbon ecosystem services, and how this information can be used to enhance ecosystem management in the Bay and support increased investment in restoration and conservation efforts. This project was part of a truly amazing partnership that involved both national and regional agencies and organizations in the public and private sector. Lead funding was provided by the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund, NOAA's Office of Habitat Conservation, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency through the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Coastal Program, and Scott's Miracle-Gro. And the report was a collaborative effort of Restore America's Estuaries, Tampa Bay Estuary Program, Environmental Science Associates, Tampa Bay Watch, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. So it's really a great study because it shows how these blue carbon ecosystem services, along with all the other co-benefits of coastal wetlands, can really pull together a very collaborative group of folks. So with that, I will pass the reins over to Steve Crooks.
also sequester carbon as well. So the concept of blue carbon is really a way of recognizing the role of coastal blue carbon ecosystems within the climate change mitigation framework, and discussing and sharing our understanding amongst different communities of scientists and policy people. I'm having a little bit of trouble moving on to the next slide. Stephanie, there we are. Thank you.
Working very
So, you know, here we are in Florida, and when we think about blue carbon, we're actually trying to connect together a lot of dots when it comes to coastal ecosystems. We're recognizing that as we restore wetlands, are part of an integrated multi-use landscape. We're trying to restore sustainable livelihoods and economies. Particularly related to the carbon aspect, we're trying to connect together mitigation actions and adaptation actions. The two need to be connected together to be successful. You can also integrate natural infrastructure and flood risk reduction along with blue carbon, as together, you know, they're a wider part of ecosystem services provided by coastal wetlands that are, which are sympathetic. And one additional factor that is on the edge of being explored really is the links between wetlands and ocean acidification. And we touch upon this within this study. Next slide, please. So in terms of an overarching framework, how do we connect policy with these kind of environmental science aspects? We're calling upon overarching within this study, the DPSIR framework, which developed in the 90s. Really looking at there are drivers within the global system that are causing pressures within the environment. We have climate change, sea level rise, food production, urbanization, for example. These are pressures, flooding, nutrient loading, pollution. Now these lead to a state change in the environment that we can measure and recognize, model and monitor. Reduction of habitat, eutrophication, species decline, which in turn lead to a social impact that we feel as a community. It could be reduced livelihoods, it could be reduced length of life, reduced welfare. And also in terms of the food that we eat and the quality of our life, which in turn leads to a policy response, which we hope will improve the condition rather than make it worse. And so as part of those policy responses, there are mitigation actions which can take place to reduce the drivers, and there are adaptation actions which take place to help us live with the pressures that we're feeling. Next slide, please. So from a restoration perspective, you know, what we've been trying to do as a community of restoration practitioners and managers is really improve the resilience of our coastal ecosystems. It could be on the left-hand side of these graphics, it could be any sort of metric related to that, say species diversity. We're seeing a decline in resilience with restoration. We're trying to improve resilience and improve the capacity of systems to respond to natural shocks and stresses. But at the same time, as we go down to the bottom left, you know, what we're really trying to do also is recognize that we have moving baselines. We have sea level rise that we have to deal with. We have to incorporate that into our planning. Next slide, please. From a carbon management perspective, carbon managers think in a slightly different way. What we're trying to achieve there with climate change mitigation is the difference in a project or policy relative to a baseline. And we want to have a net improvement in greenhouse gas management relative to that baseline. Now, we might have a system which is not emitting, let's say, an agricultural soil, not emitting greenhouse gases, but say growing a forest or restoring a wetland, we start to sequester CO2 out of the atmosphere. Another example might be in the top right, we have a soil that's emitting CO2. Through restoration of a wetland, we avoid the ongoing emissions, we reduce the ongoing emissions, but we also start sequestering carbon. Now, what we might also have, bottom left, is that we might have a system which is actually improving in terms of net greenhouse gas management, but we make it better, or a system which is declining over time, and we make it less worse. The important thing is the delta between the baseline and the with project or with policy. So we're trying to connect these two things together. Next slide, please. A lot of this is captured. I'm just going to put a plug in for another report, which links together these best practice guidelines into a single document. And these are overarching, and our principles that we used within the Tampa Bay project link back to this. And it recognizes this learning curve that we're all going through, but there's a need to connect together the learning that's going on in carbon projects with the learning that's been going on in wetlands restoration projects. And just to mention also that in terms of the interventions that take place, as well as carbon finance projects, there are a range of management activities and policy opportunities that could be undertaken to improve carbon management. It's not all about finance projects. Next slide, please. So why Tampa Bay? Well, Stephanie mentioned a lot of the reasons at the beginning of this presentation, but what I'll call out as well is, as we've been developing these demonstration projects around the world, around the US, a lot of the activities places we've been working in have got a good mineral sediment supply. So here we've come to Tampa Bay because it's an end member which represents a challenging environment when we think about sea level rise. It's an urbanized estuary. It has all three blue carbon ecosystems, seagrasses, mangroves, and marshes in one place. But it's a low-lying carbonate platform with no sediment availability, or very low sediment availability. So it means the response to sea level rise is going to be driven by topography. And so how well will blue carbon ecosystems do, and how can we manage our greenhouse gases in that kind of environment? And as Stephanie mentioned, there's a wealth of experience here within the Tampa Bay community. We have strong institutions, we have strong science being developed, and we have a very forward-looking planning framework which is developing within the region that Holly will tell us more about, thinking about sea level rise and balancing our ecosystems. Next slide, please. So just to lead into what Lindsay is going to talk about and give a sense of the overarching project, you know, here we developed a model. It's a SLAM-like model. Uses similar principles, but it's updated. We include carbon stock change and sequestration within this modeling analysis. It also includes seagrasses within the model, which is not an aspect that currently exists within SLAM, and so we have a subtidal component as well. The model looks at different scenarios of sea level rise from low to high, and we included some estimates of emissions associated. As part of this, some greenhouse gas accounting associated with what happens with the fate of carbon when it erodes and a wetland drowns out. The management scenarios that we looked at included hold the line and a soft retreat option. They're recognizing that some lands may be held, but some lands of low value may be retreated back upon. And as part of this analysis, we provided an assessment of some prioritization of land use. Where are some areas relative to existing restoration projects that could be included as part of expanding the opportunities for restoration on Tampa Bay? And what do we do about upland buffer areas which are not going to be flooded for some time? What we're not going to talk about within this study, but we can come back to it another time, and you can also find in the report, is we talk about the inorganic carbon pathway. Is there additional carbon sequestration associated with inorganic carbon as well as organic carbon, and how does that link to ocean acidification? And there's also a discussion about project grouping. How do we build one large carbon project involving multiple small restoration projects? And with that, I'll pass over to Lindsay, who's going to tell us about the analysis. Thank you.
Great.
All right,
Thank
Lindsay,
you, Steve.
I'm going to give you control of the slides now.
Okay.
All right, all yours.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth on the assessment that we put together for Tampa Bay. If I can make the slides go forward. Oh, great. So to look at the project setting for Tampa Bay, you can see in this image to the right that the gray area is the developed land within Tampa Bay. So 60% of the coastal lands right now are developed, and another 14% are being used for agriculture. So that only leaves 26% of the coastal area for these natural habitats. And two of the ones I want to point out in this image, the red color shows the mangrove habitat right now, and the light blue that borders the bay is seagrass habitat under existing conditions. So those are two of the bigger categories, and then also salt marsh, salt barren, freshwater marsh are interspersed within those areas as well. So Tampa is also a really interesting area to study because they've already had past successes with improving water quality, and as a result seeing an increase in seagrass. So you can see from this chart that the red line, which represents seagrass over time, shows that from the 1900s to the 1990s, there was a very large loss in seagrass. But since then, there's really been a lot of effort to restore those areas, as well as salt barrens, salt marsh, and mangroves. And as of 2015, the seagrass targets for the bay have actually been exceeded, which is really exciting. It's also an interesting location because of the future pressures that a lot of areas in the US and the world are also experiencing. So in Tampa, there's expected to be a doubling of the coastal population by 2050. So as more people are moving to the coast, the sea level rise is also threatening habitats. So they're being squeezed out in a way. So this was kind of the background for this study. So the three things that we were really looking at were what are the benefits of coastal habitat restoration and conservation, and trying to kind of put some numbers to that. And then also identifying opportunities for management of these coastal systems. And then lastly, we wanted to kind of give another point that people could use in terms of this blue carbon as a reason why habitat restoration should go forward. So another little checkbox, if you will, for a reason of why we should do restoration because of the carbon sequestration that we get through these blue carbon habitats. So this graphic shows kind of a layout of the study that we did. So we started by gathering habitat acreages from the historic habitats from the literature, like you saw in that first bar chart of how the habitats have evolved over time to date. We also looked at the GPRA reporting. So this is the Government Performance and Results Act that all of the national estuary programs need to report back to the EPA about restoration work that's been done. And we actually developed a pretty cool tool for calculating sequestrations based on this reporting. And that I think Polly will talk a little bit on, and it will be a future webinar. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. And then we use this model that Steve was starting to talk about, and we call it the Habitat Evolution Model, or the HEM model. And we developed this based on the SLAM model, the Sea Level Affecting Marshes model, and furthered it to add some additional capabilities to look at what we wanted to look at to predict into the future how our habitat acreages would change over time. So once we had those habitat acreages, we took recommendations from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, as well as Tampa-specific field data, so both on the carbon within the biomass out in Tampa marshes and mangroves, as well as the carbon that's been stored in the soils. And then we combine this with field data from a seagrass study, so looking at the carbon sequestration in seagrass. And using these recommendations and pieces of data, we developed our greenhouse gas accounting framework and put in the habitat acreages with these rates of sequestration and emissions. And from that, produced results that let us look at, let's see if this is going to the next slide, all of these pieces that you see down at the bottom. So we are, I'm going to talk a little bit on each of these, and specifically the last one, identifying prioritized parcels, towards the end. I think I might have lost control. Oh, there it goes. Oops, cool. So to talk a little bit more about the habitat evolution model, so as Steve mentioned, we looked at the SLAM model to start, and this is an EPA model that has fixed habitat categories and a decision tree. So it's basically a big if-then statement. So if you're at a certain elevation and you're experiencing freshwater or not, and sea level rises, what habitat will you convert to? So some of the limitations that we found in modeling Tampa with SLAM is that because of this fixed habitat categories, they didn't necessarily represent some of the processes that we were seeing in Tampa Bay. So for example, almost all of the habitats convert down to mangroves in SLAM, which was overestimating the mangrove habitat that we think we'd see into the future. And on the reverse side, almost none of the habitats were converting to salt-bearen, so basically all of the salt-bearen disappeared over time. And then lastly, as Steve mentioned, one of the really important things we wanted to look at was how seagrass is expected to evolve over time. And the SLAM model does not include subtidal categories. So this was something that we added to our model. So we developed the HEM in GIS, so it's a GIS-based model, and I'm going to present some of the results. Hopefully. There we go. So actually, this is a little bit more about the model. So these are the habitat categories that we developed for Tampa. So if you're in an area that does not experience fresh water, we would expect to have upland habitat at the highest elevations down to through salt-bearen, high salt marsh, mangroves, and seagrass. And you can see on the right-hand side, we have these tidal water elevations. So if, for example, you're in an area that's currently mangrove, you're going to be between mean high water and mean low water. So you're getting a certain amount of inundation every day. And as mean low water rises with sea level rise, you might drop into this area where seagrass is starting to occur. So this is kind of the idea behind the model, is this evolution. Next slide, please. So these are the habitat categories that we have with freshwater. So upland and salt-bearen, again, with high salt marsh, and then evolving down into the low or Juncus marsh that we see in the Tampa Bay freshwater areas, and then down to mudflat and eventually seagrass. And next slide. So the runs that we looked at to kind of get a sense of the sensitivity of our predictions, we looked at varying levels of sea level rise, so a low rate and then a high rate. And then we also looked at varying sediment accretion. And then we looked at two management practices, as Steve was mentioning. So we looked at holding the line and not allowing marshes to migrate into developed areas, and then also allowing them to migrate, so into areas that might be a golf course today or agricultural lands, kind of the softer development where there's not necessarily a building already there. Next slide. So these maps show results for our two sea level rise runs. So on the left are our habitat categories in our existing conditions, which for the model was based off of 2007 land use data. And you can see at the beginning, again, that red and the light blue habitats are really popping out. So red is our mangrove habitats, and just next to those are the seagrass habitats that lines most of the bay. Black and gray in this map are the developed areas. So again, you can see how developed the Tampa Bay area is. The two right panels show our habitats in 2100 with low rates of sea level rise in the middle and then high rates of sea level rise on the right. And what was really interesting about these results is that with low rates of sea level rise, the mangrove habitat was able to keep up with sea level rise pretty well due to accretion and building up over time. And so you can see that most of that red habitat is still there. And in some places, the mangroves have even moved into areas of high marsh or upland with sea level rise. On the right, it paints a sadder story. We see that most of the mangrove areas have gone and that seagrass has really moved into most of those areas. So these intertidal habitats in 2007 are converting to subtidal habitats by 2100 under high sea level rise scenarios. And next slide. So we then looked at our varying rates of accretion. And so this shows a high rate of sea level rise with both low accretion and high accretion. So again, we have 2007 habitats on the left for comparison. And in the middle, this is that same sad map that you saw a moment ago. And this is high sea level rise, but with low accretion. And you can see, like we were looking at before, that most of these habitats convert to seagrass and subtidal. But what was interesting is that if we use a higher rate of accretion, and these rates were based on review of the literature, so these rates have been seen in some areas, we see that the mangroves can keep up. So So really determining what accretion rates are realistic is going to be a really important next step for determining the fate of these habitats. Next slide, please. So, and this was our last scenario, is that we looked at the protecting and not protecting our development for the two management scenarios. And what was pretty interesting about these results is that we didn't see a huge difference. You can see a little bit of mangrove kind of in the middle of Tampa Bay on the right panel that's not there in the middle panel. But for the most part, if you are looking at this scale, there's not a whole lot of change if we don't protect those areas. So this might mean looking at some of the harder developed areas, or focusing more on maintaining low levels of sea level rise and looking for that higher level of accretion. Next slide, please. So we also developed some maps to look specifically at certain habitat changes, more zoomed in to get a better sense of what was going on. So this is a map of middle Tampa Bay and looking at the Juncus Marsh within middle Tampa Bay. So the areas in red are areas that in 2007 show Juncus Marsh, but that we predict by 2100 will no longer be that habitat type. And green are areas where we gain Juncus Marsh as it moves upslope, and then blue are the areas that stay the same. So in this freshwater brackish habitat, you can see that the areas further back, oops, thanks. You can see the areas that are further back in the river don't change as much as the areas that are tidally influenced. So making sure that there are areas for the Juncus Marsh to move back further up into the systems will be important going forward. Next slide. So this map shows the changes in salt marsh, and you can, oops. You can see in the red that there's a loss. Okay. There's a loss of salt marsh, a pretty large loss of salt marsh. There's a little bit of green, so we're gaining some at the upper end. And up in the northern portion of middle Tampa Bay, we have some areas of no change, but there's really a loss for the salt marsh. So for mangroves, you can see that the mangroves really moved to fill in that salt marsh that was there before, but there's a huge loss at the bay's edge. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see there's that it's really the seagrass that's moving into those areas. So that green area for seagrass is a gain where it was a loss for the mangroves. And on the deeper edges of the seagrass is where we would expect to see some habitat loss for seagrass as the water becomes too deep to support the seagrass habitat. So to go back to our little layout here, we've just talked about the HEM model, so up in the upper right corner, and how we developed our habitat acreages. And now we're going to look more at not so much the recommendations during this talk, but the greenhouse gas accounting framework and how we use these acreage to come up with calculating our emissions and sequestrations. So for thinking about blue carbon, the three important carbon stocks that we really think about is the above ground biomass, so that's the actual plants and mangroves, and then also the soil stock and the below ground biomass. So as Steve was talking about, there's really a lot of carbon in the soil when you have the regular inundation of tidal waters to kind of keep that stored in that soil. And then also with mangroves, we get dead organic matter. So when the mangroves die, you still have that organic matter saved in the trees until they are washed away or released back into the atmosphere. So also, as Steve touched on, seagrasses may also use this bicarbonate pathway, which is a chemical transition of the carbon into a way that it can be stored in the ocean. So that is another way that carbon may be being sequestered in these systems. So to just walk through kind of how these carbon stocks change over time. So if you start on the left-hand side with an area of land that's agricultural grassland, And the blue lines represent your mean high water, so the average of all the high waters every day that are experienced. So when we're below, when the land is above this area, you have some amount of above ground biomass and a little bit of soil carbon, but that really increases as you move to the next image as your water level rises and the soils can build up and store that carbon. If this land, if the water levels keep rising and this land converts to marsh, then your above ground biomass increases as marshes sequester carbon better than grasslands, and your soil carbon continues increasing as well. Eventually, you get to a point where your vegetation can't survive, and so you'll convert to mudflat or open water. And at this point, you no longer have biomass, so you don't have that carbon stock, and you've also stopped accumulating soil carbon. As Steve touched upon, we also looked at how much, assuming an amount of erosion that would occur during this time. So when you no longer have the vegetation holding your sediment in place, we would expect that waves and currents would wash some of that soil away, and it could be released back into the atmosphere. In Tampa, because we have that seagrass, that would come in after you convert to open water, and that would provide both biomass and additional soil carbon sequestration as well. So this is a table of our results. So we ran each of the 5 runs that we looked at for the HEM model, and we looked at a couple of different things. So we looked at the loss in biomass between 2007 and 2100, and this is due to things like mangroves drowning out. So when you have mangrove habitat, you have a lot of biomass, and as that drowns out, and you're either converting to seagrass or to open water, you lose that biomass. So that's why all of these numbers are negative. It's a loss of carbon storage. We also looked at a change in the soil carbon stocks, and these numbers were all pretty similar. We looked at the cumulative carbon sequestered by 2100, and this included the soil carbon stock that already exists in these habitats. And then we haven't talked about it a lot today, but the methane emissions. So when you're in freshwater or brackish marsh conditions, there is some emissions of methane, and so that is negative to our sequestration total. And then combining the cumulative carbon with the methane emissions gives us the net greenhouse gases sequestered by 2100. So to go a little more into detail on these numbers, this plot shows the change in biomass for each of the runs. So these first 2 lines up top are the runs for the low rates of sea level rise. So over time, you do lose some biomass, but it's pretty steady, and the habitats do a pretty good job keeping up. The 2 bottom lines in green and orange represent the high sea level rise and low accretion rate runs, and you can see there's really a large drop as mangroves start drowning out around 2075. And it's interesting to look at the purple line because, again, when you have that high accretion with the high sea level rise, that really helps counter some of the effects of sea level rise, and the biomass is able to hang out for much longer. So it's much closer to those low sea level rise scenarios. So looking at the soil sequestration, it was pretty interesting that we found that there was only a 2% difference between all of the runs. And that's just because with the soil sequestration, if you have mangroves and then down into seagrass or salt marsh, all of those habitats are sequestering soil or sequestering carbon in the soil. So it's really a continuous process for the soil sequestration, even as the habitats evolve down in the tide frame. Similarly with methane emissions, it's only a 5% difference between all the runs. And it's interesting to see that the scenarios kind of flip. So again, this orange and green line at the top are high level of sea level rise and low accretion rates. And because of the high sea level rise, more of the freshwater and brackish marshes are converted to salt marsh, which emits less methane, so they actually have lower methane emissions by 2100 than the other scenarios. So this kind of shows a summary of all of these factors. So the top, the dotted lines represent the carbon sequestration for each run. The bottom dotted lines represents the methane emissions for each run. And then these middle solid lines are the cumulative combination of both. And again, you can see pretty well from this graphic that the runs themselves are pretty close together when you're looking at the greenhouse gas fluxes. So one of the last pieces of the study that we looked at was prioritizing parcels for restoration. And what we did is we took parcel data and we overlaid the highest astronomical tide. So this is the highest water level that you get just based on the tides without storm, swell, or waves on top of it. And we identified areas that would be inundated by this highest astronomical tide in 2100. And so these were the areas that would most likely be that folks would move back out of to avoid this regular inundation. And then we also differentiated between public and private parcels. So this is a map of one example of the maps, the sort of maps that we put together for this. And this is again Middle Tampa Bay. And in the red, we're showing areas that will be inundated, upland areas that will be inundated by 2100. And then also looking at in yellow, the contiguous remaining uplands. So these are areas that are also uplands that are touching some of these to be inundated uplands. So basically areas where you could have the most contiguous wetland habitat. And then the orange and the green show the public and private parcels of these different areas. So to wrap up some conclusions, our habitat evolution modeling showed that the intertidal habitats are likely to decrease with sea level rise, but that fortunately the increase in seagrass is probably going to move into these areas. With the higher rates of sea level rise, there's definitely a larger loss of the intertidal habitats, but if there's higher accretion rates realized, then this might offset some of that loss to some extent. We also found that most of the GHG fluxes were pretty similar between scenarios, and that was interesting. And although it's not a huge difference when we look at the management options for the GHG fluxes, it's still going to be a really important management technique to allow migration of these habitats if we are to maintain these habitats into the future. And lastly, we thought it's very important if we're counting on seagrasses to continue this carbon sequestration for us into the future, it's going to be really important that the water quality is maintained so that the seagrasses can move into these areas that were previously occupied by salt marsh or mangrove habitat. So going forward, some of the priorities that we identified are looking at the essential infrastructure and development that really needs to be protected and left in place, but then also becoming aware of where we are building our new infrastructure and development and trying to avoid the coastal flood-prone areas that we've identified in our mapping. And then also hoping those maps can be used to acquire developed parcels that may be being inundated more frequently into the future, and these areas could be used as restoration. And then lastly, really identifying these areas that should be conserved and looking at the sustainability of these habitats into the future. And I think that's all I've got.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. I'd like to next invite Holly Greening to provide us with some take-home messages and concluding remarks from the Estuary program. Holly?
I'd like to first thank Lindsay and Steve for a great summary of a very complex project, and really looking forward to using these results for our science and management approaches. could you move forward, please, one? Some of the take-home messages for management, I think the major one is that as we are all looking for additional reasons to restore and protect habitat, we've been focused so much on the importance to the flora and fauna in our area, and you know, in the public benefits of restoring and protecting habitat. But I think the blue carbon sequestration capacities of our coastal habitats is a great new reason and another reason to restore and protect habitat. Certainly from the climate change mitigation and planning perspective, understanding the carbon benefits of the climate change potential for mitigation is a very important new piece of information that we will be using here. We didn't talk about it in this presentation so much, but there is an emerging and potentially large carbon market that may be an economic benefit as that carbon market becomes more established here in the United States. So there are certainly areas of the country that are looking at this in detail now. But there may be an even more reason to really focus on the blue carbon elements. And finally, I think that this provides us with a new measure of habitat benefit. Lindsay mentioned the Government Performance and Results Act, all of us, the GPRA reporting that the NEPs and other entities conduct on an annual basis. If we can add the carbon sequestration and blue carbon benefits of the habitats that we're reporting, that provides us with a new and quantifiable measure of habitat benefits, again, from this work and others around the country. Next slide, please. Some of the next steps here in Tampa Bay. We are hoping to be able to expand the GPRA tool to other areas and other habitats. And we'll be conducting a webinar probably within the next several months, taking a look at the GPRA tool that has been developed for Tampa Bay that I think could be very easily exported to other areas. And so that's a very exciting new way to report on the benefits of all of our programs. The carbon market potential is, again, something that we are just starting to explore, and I think that certainly is something that here in the Tampa Bay area we would like to explore a little bit further. And one of the very exciting science elements of this, I think, that we're exploring now is ocean acidification implications. And we are doing some work here in Tampa Bay now with our expanded seagrasses. We are also seeing an increase in our pH in Tampa Bay, which is, of course, opposite to the global trend of decreasing pH with increasing ocean acidification. There have been other areas of the country and around the world where increased seagrass is also associated with a buffering of that decreased pH from ocean acidification global trends. So that is certainly a very exciting new avenue of research that the Tampa Bay Estuary Program is working with many partners here to explore further. So that, you know, there's a lot of new elements here. I think the most important one for us is that it is another way of getting out the message of how important our coastal habitats are. It's not just for the fish and the wildlife and the fishermen. It is also an important avenue for climate change mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So again, thank you to the team with Restore America's Estuaries and ESA. This has just been a great project for us. And with that, I'll turn it back over.
All right, thank you, Holly, Lindsay, and Steve. We do have some time for questions, so if you have a question for any of our panelists, you can enter that into the question box. A reminder that a recording of this webinar will be available online on our website later this week or early next week. You can also find resources mentioned today, including of course, the Tampa Bay assessment report and the Snohomish report and other resources on our website, as well as an opportunity to sign up for our monthly Blue Carbon Buzz email list to receive monthly updates on blue carbon events, publications, webinars, including the one that Holly mentioned that will be coming up on the GIPRA model. And again, we have a brief survey that you'll be prompted to answer at the end of the webinar, and we really appreciate that feedback. So we'll go into a couple of questions here, and I invite all our panelists to, including others listening in from the Estuary program, to chime in. One question that's come up, what were the various sea level rise rates you mentioned using the low and high? What were those rates?
This is Lindsay. We used a report from Tampa Bay, and we used the two middle values. I want to say that the high was about 55 inches. I'd have to pull that up to get that exactly, and the low was around 20, 22, 23.
Okay. We have a question here. Does the habitat modeling take into account potential lag times and habitat suitability as mangroves transition to seagrass habitat? And it also says for some period of time, for example, it would seem that standing dead biomass might inhibit seagrass from establishing.
Yeah, that's a really great question. We run the model on, I'd say our shortest time frame that we'd run it is like a 10-year time step. So I think for this report, we ran it with 25-year time steps. So we're kind of making the assumption that that 25-year time step is enough time for that transition to happen.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Next question, probably for our estuary program folks. Have you approached local communities, bay users, to design co-management schemes to improve blue carbon storage?
This is Holly. We are in the process of updating our comprehensive plan right now. And as part of that, we're reevaluating all of our long-term habitat restoration project targets and goals. And this information from the blue carbon report and assessment here will certainly be something that that will be incorporated into the development of those long-term goals. And many of the projects, the habitat restoration projects that are ongoing right now, do take into account the potential for incorporating sea level rise. I think as we have learned, you know, which types of habitats might be important for the greenhouse gas mitigation, that will be another element that we incorporate into our long-term plan. So this is brand new information, and you know, I think it will be very important as we move forward in incorporating.
Great, thanks, Holly. Next question, what are characteristics of locations that would be ideal for replication? Is there a size limitation or limitation on diversity of habitats? And I think this might be maybe more for Steve or Lindsay.
I'll take a crack. You know, a couple of things that this study brought out, just to highlight more broadly. The existence of the seagrass is really dependent upon maintaining water quality. And so one of the parameters that's important to recognize in here is that the assumption was made that the seagrass, the water quality would be continued into the future, and therefore the seagrass would continue to exist. So that's an important parameter to recognize. On the habitat restoration at the top end, the scenarios that were developed, there wasn't a great deal between the hold the line and the soft retreat because there weren't a lot of soft retreat options. But it does open up the question about if the community of Tampa Bay want to maintain mangroves into the future under high rate of sea level rise, then it opens a question about, well, where do you create that space and how do you prioritize, and should more space be made available? So as part of the prioritization, and the question then becomes, where does that habitat fit? And thinking about the connectivity and the proximity to existing habitats will be important as part of that. Lindsay, did you have additional aspects?
I guess I was interpreting the question differently than you. I thought, and maybe the asker can clarify, but if it's in terms of like, can we do this analysis again at different locations? I think, especially for the habitat evolution modeling, it is something, because we've designed this model that is flexible, we now have that ability to change it for different habitat types and different habitat evolution processes. I think we ran the model with 10-meter cells, so doing like project specific is probably too small, but in terms of other estuaries and that sort of thing, if this is what the question was asking, then I think it is very applicable, and we could really recreate it anywhere.
Great. Thanks, Steve and Lindsay. I think that's great. Lindsay, that's the way I took the question to be asked as well, but all good information. Another question, did the model include increased water temperatures that are expected in the future?
No, we did not include that, but that would be something interesting to look at into the future.
Absolutely. And then I have a question. What would you think could be done when you're looking at the different accretion rates? What can be done to help manage for those accretion rates?
I'm not sure if there's, we talked about this a lot as we were writing the report. I'm not sure what management options are available so much as, just getting a better understanding of what those rates really are. So we did get some Tampa-specific data in this analysis, but I think getting more data just going into the future as, sea level rise keeps increasing and seeing how those rates change will help us refine the predictions going into the future.
Yeah, just to add to that, for salt marshes, the science is pretty strong in terms of understanding how tidal marshes will respond to sea level rise under different amounts of mineral and organic sedimentation. We have a sense of the limits there. Interestingly, for mangroves, while there is quite a bit of data on accretion rates of mangrove systems under existing sea level rise, there isn't really a strong observational science developed yet on how mangroves will respond under low sediment availability conditions. Do the fact that trees exist in mangrove systems, does that provide more resilience or not than tidal marshes? So we really have an open question there about the capacity of mangroves to respond to sea level rise in low sediment availability conditions. And that's part of the reason why we have a range in here for Tampa Bay, because we couldn't narrow that down with the existing science.
This is Gary Rollerson. Can you hear me?
Yes, Gary, we can hear you.
One of the management options we have, at least in Tampa Bay, is the use, and we're still exploring this as a possibility, it's definitely by no means set in stone, so to speak, is the use of beneficial dredge material. We have Port of Tampa Bay, Port Manatee coming in through Tampa Bay, and there's the potential of doing some basically broadcast disbursement of the good grain size sediment that's fits our criteria to help us keep up with sea level rise in some of these areas. So that's one management option we will be pursuing further as time goes on.
Great, thank you all. There was a comment or two also about the seagrass change maps. It's a little bit difficult to go back into that with the webinar settings. It's a more one-way conversation, but I would urge, if you were the one who asked about that, to take a look at the report available online. The maps are available within that report, or to send one of us an email. So you can send Lindsay, Steve, an email about those maps if you have questions, or questions to Holly or myself as well. Our emails are on the screen.
Yes, definitely.
And again, the report is available at estuaries.org/bluecarbon-resources. and we will be having future webinars on other areas where blue carbon can be used, blue carbon in practice, including a webinar on the GIPRA model that Holly and Steve mentioned. So that about wraps up our webinar for today. I just want to thank all of our speakers for being available today and thank all of you for joining us for this. Please do remember to fill out the survey questions when you're prompted when leaving the webinar. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.